Okay, we are live. You can go ahead and start the trial.
All right, good morning, everyone. We just received the message to get started. Let's call the case of Stevie Rogers versus Drew Mars. My name is Judge Ferlani. Scoring judges, please look at the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and remember to mute your audio and video unless the bailiff tells you otherwise. You should have your video set to hide all non-video participants, meaning that the only people on your screen should be myself and the advocates. Attorneys, could you please start with your appearances?
Of course. Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Sonali Mehta. I'm joined by my co-counsel, Mr. Elias Nybart.
Good morning, Your Honor.
And Your Honor, together we represent the plaintiff in today's case, Ms. Stevie Rogers.
Good morning, Your Honor.
All right, defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Josie Bianchi, and today, along with my co-counsel, Mr. Matthew McCurdy.
Good morning, Your Honor.
We represent the defendant in today's case, Mr. Drew Mars.
Good morning, Your Honor.
All right, are there any housekeeping matters that we have to attend to, or can we move on to opening?
A few housekeeping matters from the plaintiff, Your Honor.
Sure, go ahead.
First, we just wanted to draw your attention to a stipulation signed by Judge Page, which says that exhibits 1 through 7 have already been pre-admitted. Both sides have already agreed on this.
Okay, defense, is that true?
That's our understanding, yes.
Okay, noted.
Next, Your Honor, given the online nature of today's trial, we wanted to ask your permission to display exhibits on the screen if we are trying to enter them into evidence so as to show the witness constructively out of the eye shot and earshot of the jury.
That's fine.
Finally, Your Honor, we did want to let you know that there was originally a police investigation that found facts relevant to today's case. Both parties have agreed on that. Unfortunately, in Midlands, we can't subpoena police officers for civil proceedings, but we will be having a private investigator testify who worked with the police during this case. Again, per those stipulations, this private investigator can in fact testify about the police report, and we intend on having her do so.
Defense?
That's our understanding of the stipulation as well.
Okay. Any other housekeeping matters?
Nothing further from the plaintiff, Your Honor. We're ready for opening statements.
Defense?
A few matters from the defense, Your Honor.
Sure.
We'd like to invoke Midlands Rule 603, constructively swearing in all witnesses prior to testimony.
Sure.
And we also like to invoke Rule 615, which constructively sequesters all witnesses barring party representatives. Of course, due to the unique constraints of today's proceedings, we'd have both party representatives constructively seated at counsel table. And for the pretrial order, it's our understanding that both Stevie Rogers and Drew Mars are required to be in trial throughout its entirety today.
Okay, so the other two witnesses were constructively sequestering those two. Okay, any objections to that from plaintiff?
No objection, Your Honor. We've stipulated to that already.
Okay, those witnesses will be constructively sequestered. Anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor. With that, we're ready to proceed.
Well, then let's move on to opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view. That button is on the upper right hand of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And plaintiff, we'll start with you.
May it please the court? Desperation, drugs, deceit. On August 14th, 2018, the defendant Drew Mars, a home nurse, stood next to Agatha Lee's bed. Agatha Lee was his boss, a wealthy, elderly, famous author. In one hand, the defendant held a small purple pill, an arthritis medication that Agatha took every single night. In the other hand, he held an identical purple pill. But this one, it wasn't arthritis medication. It was a drug, so deadly to Agatha that a single pill could stop her heart. The defendant switched the pills, knowing that his boss would take whatever her nurse gave her. By the next morning, Agatha Lee was dead. and the defendant was $20 million richer. See, members of the jury, when Agatha Lee died, she left her fortune to the defendant. She had written a will which named him the sole beneficiary of her will. But members of the jury, here in Midlands, we don't allow anyone to kill another person and then profit off of their death. That's why Agatha's family has brought this lawsuit, to ensure that the defendant doesn't walk away with Agatha's estate. That means that it's our job to prove to you that it is more likely than not that the defendant intentionally killed Agatha Lee. We're going to meet that burden today by showing you that the defendant was desperate for the money, that he drugged Agatha Lee, and that he tried to deceive everyone in order to get away with this. First, you're going to learn that the defendant was desperate for that money. See, the defendant had a sick sibling, and he needed the money so he could take care of his family. You'll learn that the defendant decided he had to kill Agatha Lee when it looked like that money was slipping through his fingers. See, the very day before she died, Agatha decided she wanted to leave her money to family and not to the defendant. You're going to hear today how the defendant reacted when he found that out, how his face turned red, how he clenched his fists and said, "No way," how he became desperate. Next, we're going to show you the drugs that the defendant used. You're going to hear today that Agatha Lee had an allergy to a medication called chloroandramine. Well, as her nurse, the defendant was one of the only people who knew about that chloroandramine allergy. He was one of the only people in the world who knew that chloroandramine looked identical to the arthritis medication Agatha Lee took every single night. You're going to hear from Stevie Rogers today, Agatha's granddaughter, and she'll explain she had a conversation with the defendant about chloroandramine just weeks before Agatha died. The defendant said, "Just one pill of chloroandramine, and Agatha would be dead." Finally, we're going to show you how the defendant tried to deceive everyone. See, when the police started asking questions about what happened to Agatha Lee, the defendant knew they were onto him. So when his name was announced as the sole beneficiary of Agatha's will, he lied. He stood up in front of Agatha's family and friends, covered his hands with his mouth, and he said, "I had no idea," over and over again. Well, today you're going to hear from a private investigator who the Lee family hired to look into Agatha's death. And Ms. Bond is going to tell you she found an email that the defendant wrote months before Agatha died. Months before the defendant said, "I had no idea." He said, "I get everything. The house, the money, everything." See, members of the jury, over the course of today's trial, the defense is going to tell you this is all one big misunderstanding. Agatha's family is suing because they want some of that money, but members of the jury, the evidence is going to tell you what really happened. The evidence is going to show how desperate the defendant was for the money, how he drugged Agatha Lee, and how he deceived everyone to get away with this. Desperation, drugs, deceit. Today, we're going to ask you to see through that deception. At the end of today's trial, we're going to ask you to find Drew Mars liable. Thank you.
All right, defense, whenever you're ready for your opening.
It's not a coincidence. It's a setup. A millionaire dies in their sleep. And at first, it looks like a death from natural causes. But an autopsy report reveals that the real killer is a drug called chlorandramine. A private investigator is hired, and the millionaire's caretaker is accused of killing her. Sounds like the facts of today's case, right? They are. But they're also something else. You see, there's a plot of a story that Miss Mehta, she didn't tell you anything about. Death in a Bottle. It's Agatha Lee's best-selling novel, and it tells the story of a millionaire who dies in their sleep from chlorandramine. The private investigator is hired, and the millionaire's caretaker is later accused with killing her. It's not a coincidence that the facts of this story and the facts of this case are so similar. It's a setup. Good morning. My name is Josie Bianchi, and today I represent Drew Mars. The plaintiff has sued Drew Mars under Midlands Code 20.21. It's what's called the Slayer statute. And the burden to prove that lies solely with them. And now today, we're not talking in terms of guilty or not guilty. No, we're talking in terms of liability. And the plaintiff has to prove each and every element of their case by a preponderance of the evidence in order to show that Mr. Mars can be found liable. They won't be able to meet that burden today. Today, you'll hear the story of Drew Mars and how Stevie Rogers tried to set him up. Now, the plaintiff in their opening statement told you how their case centered on Mr. Mars's monetary motive, knowledge of a chlorandramine allergy, access to Agatha Lee's medications, and a conversation that happened about her will on August 14th. Let's break down what the plaintiff told you. Is that monetary motive? You'll learn that Drew Mars wasn't the only person who had been in Agatha Lee's will. Stevie Rogers was in an older version of the will, and she knew that she'd been taken out and replaced with Drew Mars. You'll discover today that Miss Rogers, well, she was aware of the Slayer statute before her grandmother passed away, and she knew that if Mr. Mars was found responsible for her grandmother's death, she could inherit everything. Knowledge of a chlorandramine allergy. Yes, it's true that Mr. Mars knew of that allergy. Of course, he was her caretaker for over a decade, where Miss Lee led a happy and healthy life. Today, you'll hear that Miss Rogers, she knew of that chlorandramine allergy too. And she first learned of it 2 weeks before her grandmother died from that same deathly allergy. Access to Miss Lee's medication and bedroom. You'll learn today that on August 14th, the night before she passed away, someone else had access to medication. Someone else had access to her bedroom. Stevie Rogers had the same access too. And that conversation the plaintiff told you about that happened on August 14th, well, you'll learn today that conversation is actually in dispute. We expect Drew Mars to testify, and he'll tell you that he overheard that conversation and he heard something different. You'll also hear from the defense's second witness today, a woman named Ryan Cabrera. She was Miss Lee's biographer. And she'll tell you that she met with Agatha Lee just an hour after that conversation that's in dispute. And it's there that Miss Lee corroborated the version of events Mr. Mars heard. Now, you might be asking yourselves, how do we know this was a setup? And that's a great question. The answer lies with death in a bottle. You'll hear today that Stevie Rogers was reading Death in a Bottle for the first time in the same month that her grandmother died. The police found a copy of Death in a Bottle bookmarked inside in Miss Rogers' room during their investigation into Agatha Lee's death. Members of the jury, that's not a coincidence. It's a setup. Throughout the course of today's trial, we as the defense ask you to listen. Listen for who had knowledge of inheriting Agatha Lee's estate, who had a monetary motive. Listen for who had access to chlorandramine and knew about that allergy. listen to who was truly desperate and who acted on that desperation. Because you'll learn today that there's someone else who knew everything that Drew Mars did on August 14th. And that's Stevie Rogers. That's why at the end of today's trial, we'll come before you and ask that you find Mr. Mars not liable for the death of Agatha Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, defense. All right, I think we're ready to move on to the first witness. Plaintiff, before you call your first witness, I will ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is on the upper right of your screen, and it'll allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. And then plaintiff, whenever you're ready, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers to the stand. May I proceed?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Hi, Ms. Rogers. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Before I start, can you see and hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Now, ma'am, could you start by introducing yourself to the members of the jury?
Hello, my name is Stevie Rogers.
Ma'am, do you know somebody named Agatha Lee?
I do. Agatha was my grandmother.
Could you tell us a little bit about her?
Agatha was a writer. Growing up, the best part of the week was always visiting Nana. She practically raised me. I really loved her.
Well, ma'am, could you tell us about the rest of your family?
I didn't have any siblings. Growing up, it was just me and my parents. But in 2008, we were in a car crash, and both my parents died. I was 20 at the time.
Ma'am, how did your life change after your parents passed?
It was hard, really hard. I tried to keep going. I wanted to be a lawyer like my dad, so I enrolled in law school, but eventually I had to drop out because I just wasn't keeping up. I lost touch with everyone at that time, even my Nana. I just wanted to forget about everything.
Well, did that change at any point?
Yeah. At some point, I woke up and, I realized that my parents wouldn't have wanted me to end up like this. So I started to get my life back on track. I went to rehab, started reconnecting with people. That was in 2018.
Ms. Rogers, would you mind telling us a little bit about your financial situation in that year, 2018?
It wasn't great. My parents had left me a trust fund when they died, but I really screwed up my life after that. Spent money on the wrong things. I had enough to get by, though.
Ma'am, did you speak with your grandmother at any point in this time, 2018?
Yeah. At the beginning of 2018, Nana sent me a letter telling me that she was taking me out of her will, and that she was leaving everything to her caretaker, Drew Mars, instead. Honestly, I understood. I knew how bad.
Your Honor, best evidence.
Okay, can someone tell me what the evidence is? Or explain your objection a little bit.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm objecting under Rule 1002 requirement of the original. Ms. Rogers testified that she received a letter and learned from that letter that Drew Mars was being added to the will, that Stevie Rogers was being taken out. And in order to elicit those specific statements of the content from that document, which we have after discovery here in today's trial, requires the original.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, under Rule 1002, an original writing is required in order to prove its content. And we're not offering this testimony to prove its content because the facts that Ms. Rogers just testified to, that Stevie was being removed from the will and Drew Mars was being put into the will. Well, we've already stipulated to those facts, Your Honor. So we're not offering this testimony to prove the facts. We're just explaining how Ms. Rogers came to know that information and how it affected her.
Defense, is that the stipulation?
Your Honor, I'm a bit confused. We haven't stipulated to anything about this letter itself. I understand Ms. Metz's point that we know Drew Mars was added to the will, but to use the fact that today's proceedings are happening in order to patch the foundation as to how this witness learned that from this document isn't right. In order to talk about the specific statements from the letter that we have as an exhibit, they're required to offer it.
Plaintiff, last word.
Yes, Your Honor. Again, Rule 1002, it's very specific. You have to offer a written recording of a statement if you're trying to prove the contents of that document. We're just not trying to prove those contents because they're already on the record. We're just explaining how Stevie Rogers came to know this information and what she did in the aftermath, how it affected her, how she ended up actually going to visit her grandmother.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection and you can continue with your direct.
Ms. Rogers, you were just telling us about this letter you received and what you did after receiving it. Could you finish?
Sure. Like I said, Nana was taking me out of her will, but honestly, I understood the whole thing. I knew how much I had messed up by not reaching out to her after my parents died.
Did you go see your grandmother at any point after you got that letter?
I did. Nana was the first person I reached out to when I got out of rehab. I went to visit her in her house in Midlands. It was the 10-year anniversary passing of my parents' passing, and honestly, I just wanted to be with family.
Ma'am, could you tell us what your relationship with your grandmother was like after you went to visit her?
Things were really good. We were spending tons of time together. She was helping me figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I was finally starting to feel like myself again.
Ma'am, earlier you mentioned that your grandmother's estate was being left to somebody named Drew Mars. Who is that person?
Drew is my grandmother's caretaker. He was living with Nana up until 2018 when I moved in.
And what was your relationship like with the defendant, Drew Mars?
If I'm being honest, we didn't really have one. We didn't talk much, but every week he was asking me when I was leaving or how long I planned to stay with my Nana.
Ma'am, I want to go ahead and fast forward to the day of August 14th, and I want to keep a timeline of what happened on that day. Mr. Nybart, could you put that on the screen for us? So, ma'am, how did that day, August 14th, start out for you?
It was pretty normal. I made breakfast for my Nana like usual, and we spent the morning together in her study.
Did you talk to your grandmother about her will on that morning?
Yeah, Nana brought it up. She told me that she felt like we had really reconnected and that she felt so grateful. She said that she was planning on changing her will back to leave everything to me instead of Drew.
And what time did that conversation happen?
It was right before we left for lunch, probably at 11:30.
So what happened next?
Well, we were leaving the study and I practically ran into Drew. She was standing right outside the door.
Ms. Rogers, do you have any idea if the defendant heard that conversation you had with your grandmother?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, I believe this objection is untimely. I asked if she knew whether or not Drew Mars heard the conversation. If she doesn't know, the jury should hear her say so.
If I may respond, Your Honor.
Sure.
The question as phrased was, do you have any idea if the defendant was listening to your conversation? And to ask if she has any idea whether or not the defendant was listening requires her to enter the mental space of the defendant. She can testify as to what she saw and heard, but to ask her if she has any idea if Mr. Mars heard this is speculative.
I'm going to overrule your objection for now. Feel free to re-raise it. If she doesn't know, she can say that, but feel free to re-raise it if you think it gets speculative.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, ma'am, do you know if the defendant heard that conversation you had with your grandmother about your grandmother's will?
I don't know for sure, but when I ran into Drew outside the door, her fists were clenched and her face was all red. She looked at me and he said, "No way."
Ma'am, what happened later on in the day after this interaction with Drew Mars?
Nana had a lunch meeting, and then we spent the rest of the day together. Nana went to bed after we finished watching a movie, maybe 9:30, and then I went downstairs.
Well, did you see the defendant at any point after you said goodnight to your grandmother?
Yeah, when I was going downstairs, I saw Drew. He was going from his bedroom across the hall to my Nana's room. It was right after I said goodnight to her. It was like 9:35 to 9:40.
Ms. Rogers, could you see if the defendant was holding anything?
I'm not really sure. He had his hand with his palm up and his fingers curled like this.
Ma'am, what did you do after you saw the defendant walking towards your grandmother's bedroom with his palm up and his fingers curled?
At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I watched Stevie downstairs for a bit and then I went to sleep.
Ms. Rogers, I know this is difficult, but I do have to ask you about what happened the next morning. Could you tell us what happened when you woke up?
Drew woke me up. It was around 8:30, and he told me that my Nana, that she wasn't moving.
Ma'am, what did you do?
I ran into her room, but she was just lying there. She wasn't moving, and her eyes were closed, but she wasn't breathing, and we couldn't find a pulse.
What happened next?
I called 911. I kept standing there just hoping that she would wake up, but nothing happened. I mean, I didn't understand that this couldn't have happened. We had just been talking the day before. I thought she was fine. I didn't understand.
Ms. Rogers, did you call anybody else besides the police on that morning?
I called a private investigator. Something about the whole thing, it just seemed wrong to me. This shouldn't have happened. I wanted to make sure that we found out the truth.
Ms. Rogers, did the police ever tell you what your grandmother's cause of death was?
Yes, the police said that she had an allergic reaction to chloroandramine. That's a heartburn medication that my Nana's really allergic to.
Did you ever speak with the defendant about chloroandramine?
Yeah, Drew brought it up one night out of nowhere. He said, "Your Nana is really allergic to chloroandramine. If she took even just one pill, she'd be dead."
Mr. Nybar, thank you for zooming out. Could you put that testimony on the timeline, please? Ms. Rogers, earlier you mentioned that your grandmother was going to change her will to leave her estate to you. Did she do that before she died?
No. Nana never got the chance to. She
Objection,
died.
Your Honor. Speculation. May I be heard?
Yes.
Specifically to the statement, she never got the chance to, because she died, being the only reason that she didn't change her will. We don't know what really happened in that conversation. We don't know if Agatha Lee tried to reach out to her attorney was on vacation, if Agatha Lee had a change of heart. For this witness to say that she didn't get the chance to change her will because she died is speculative.
Plaintiff, your response?
Yes, Your Honor. Like Ms. Rogers previously testified, her grandmother told her she was planning on changing her will at about 11 a.m. on the 14th. By 8 a.m. on the 15th, she had passed away. Now, this witness testified she was with her grandmother throughout the day. It's perfectly within her rationally based perception to say that her grandmother simply didn't have a chance to change that will, to begin that legal process of making the actual change, since she died less than 24 hours later. It's not speculation, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain the objection and will strike that statement from the record. Jury, please disregard.
Yes, Your Honor.
Without telling us why your grandmother did or didn't change her will, do you know if she did change her will before she passed away?
No, ma'am. When they read out the will, it said that Drew got everything.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time. And Mr. Nybart, you can take the timeline down. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to give the scoring judges a moment. Switching screens between ballots can take a second, so. All right, and then whenever you're ready, defense, you can start with your cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Rogers. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I'm going to be asking you a few questions today on behalf of Drew Mars, okay?
Sure.
Let's start by talking about your relationship with your grandmother. It's true that you two had grown apart for a number of years, right?
Yes, ma'am. When I was little, things were really good. We were super close. I spent most of my days with her when I was little, but after my parents passed away, yes, I stopped reaching out to her.
After you dropped out of law school in 2011, the next time you saw your grandmother alive was in 2018, right?
Yes, ma'am. After my
So
parents
for those
died,
7 years,
I really just, I wasn't myself. I lost contact with a lot of important people. When I reached out to her in 2018, I felt like I really needed to apologize to her.
I'm not asking what you felt like you needed to do, Ms. Rogers. All my questions can be answered with a yes or a no. And if you feel like they can't, please let me know. For those 7 years, you never saw your grandmother in person, right?
No, ma'am. We called a few times, but I never saw her in person.
Well, isn't it true that you only remember calling your grandmother once during those 7 years?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
And you never wrote to her during those 7 years, did you?
No, ma'am. I knew that I hurt her by not staying in touch. That's why I went to see her in 2018 to make things right.
The next form of communication you had with her after 2011 was that letter that you mentioned on direct examination, right?
Yes, ma'am. Nana sent that to me in February 2018.
And that's the letter where you learned you were being taken out of the will. Drew Mars was replacing you, right?
Yes, ma'am. Nana explained that Drew was her caretaker, and that since I hadn't been reaching out to her, she felt like she needed to take me out of her will. And, honestly, I understood.
Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive to everything after yes.
Yeah, I'll sustain it. We'll strike that. The witness doesn't have to strictly answer yes or no, but try to be responsive to the question.
Ms. Rogers, let's turn now to your financial situation in 2018. You talked about it a little bit on direct examination, and I'd like to break it down a bit more for the members of the jury. After your parents died in 2008, you were left a trust fund, right?
Yes, ma'am. After my parents died, they wanted to make sure that I was taken care of, so they put the trust fund together.
It started with $2 million in it, yes?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
By June of 2018, that $2 million trust fund had $2,000 in it. Isn't that true?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
You went to go see your grandmother for the first time in 7 years after your trust fund went down to $2,000, right?
Yes, ma'am. I got out of rehab in May of that year. It was my parents' 10th year anniversary of passing. I wanted to go see her.
I didn't ask about rehab, Ms. Rogers. I asked if the first time you saw her was after your trust fund was at $2,000, and that's true, right?
Yes, ma'am. I went to see her in July.
Oh, Ms. Rogers, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what you knew back in August of 2018. In August of 2018, you believed that Drew Mars would inherit your grandmother's estate, right?
Yes, ma'am. My grandmother sent me that letter at the beginning of 2018, and she said that Drew was going to inherit everything.
You knew what the Slayer statute was back in August of 2018, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You sued under the Slayer statute today?
Yes, ma'am. This whole thing it isn't what my grandmother would have wanted. It's
Objection,
not
Your Honor,
right.
non-responsive.
Yeah, I'll sustain that. We'll strike everything after the initial yes.
So in August of 2018, you knew that if Drew Mars was responsible for your grandmother's death, that you would inherit everything, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In August of 2018, you also knew that your grandmother had a deathly chlorandramine allergy, right?
Yes, ma'am. When I arrived at her house, her caretaker, Drew Mars, explained to me that she was allergic to it.
That's right. You learned about that allergy in the same month that your grandmother died as a result of it. Isn't that true?
Yes, ma'am. Drew Mars told me that she was allergic.
In August of 2018, you were also reading your grandmother's famous novel, Death in a Bottle, right?
Yes, ma'am. When I moved in, my grandmother recommended that I read it. She said if I wanted to be an author, what better way than to learn from the best?
Well, from that story, you knew that a millionaire dies as a result of chlorandramine poisoning, right?
Yes, ma'am. That's the plot of her book.
You also knew that in the book, the millionaire's caretaker is accused with her murder, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And it's true that the police, they found a copy of this book with a bookmark inside of it in your room during their investigation, right?
Yes, ma'am. Like I said, my grandmother recommended that I pick up the book and read it.
Okay. We just talked about all of August 2018. Ms. Rogers, let's now focus in on August 14th. The only people living in the house on August 14th were yourself, your grandmother, and Drew Mars, right?
Yes, ma'am. Stevie, Drew was Nana's caretaker, and I moved in July.
Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yeah.
She asked the witness who was living in the house. She was explaining that she moved in and that Drew was the caretaker. It's perfectly aligned with the question of who was living there, explaining why they were living there.
Defense, you have a response?
Your Honor, the question didn't need an explanation as to why anyone moved in. It was tailored to, on August 14th, the only people living there were yourself, Ms. Lee, and Drew Mars. We've established that these three people have lived in that house. I'm simply asking for the state specifically.
I'm going to overrule this one. And just because we keep getting this objection brought up, the witness can offer some explanation as long as it's related to the question. I'll allow it. If it starts going beyond that question, then that's when I'll sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. So on August 14th, the three of you were the only people living there, right?
Yes, ma'am. I moved in July of that year.
And on August 14th, both Drew Mars and your grandmother, they stepped out of the house for a bit of time, right?
I think so, yes, ma'am. I'm not quite sure about the exact times.
Yeah, I didn't ask you about the exact time, Ms. Rogers. I asked that if for some portion of the day, the two of them had left on August 14th, and they did, right?
Yes, ma'am. I think so.
And to your knowledge, Ms. Rogers, no doors were locked in Ms. Lee's mansion that day, were they?
I really don't know. I'm sorry, ma'am.
Well, if you wanted to go into Agatha Lee's bedroom on August 14th, you could have, right?
I'm not sure. Sorry. Agatha has a lock on her room. I didn't try and go in that day.
So you didn't try to go into the room that day. Is that what you're telling us?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if anything was physically preventing you from going inside the room?
I'm not sure. I didn't try and go in that day. I'm sorry, ma'am.
All right, Ms. Rogers, let's finish by breaking down the timeline of events after your grandmother passed away. Mr. McCurdy, would you put a timeline on the screen for us? Ms. Rogers, on August 14th, you had a conversation with Agatha Lee about her will, right?
Yes, ma'am. We were talking in her study, and she said that she felt really grateful that we had finally reconnected and that she was going to put me back in her will.
Yeah, that to the timeline. On August 15th, you found her dead in her bedroom, right?
Yes, ma'am. That's when we found her dead.
Later that day, on August 15th, you told 911 you believed Agatha Lee had been murdered, right?
Yes, ma'am. The whole thing, it didn't make sense to me. I had been talking to my nana the day before, and everything seemed fine. I didn't understand how she could show up dead the next day.
Let's flash forward 5 days to August 20th. You were present that day for Miss Lee's will reading, right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And later that day, you filed today's lawsuit against Drew Mars.
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
And you're accusing Mr. Mars of killing your grandmother with chlorandramine pills, right?
Yes, ma'am. The whole thing, it just doesn't make sense. My nana was healthy and she was strong. It shouldn't have happened.
Ms. Rogers, it's true that you didn't receive the autopsy report for your grandmother until August 21st, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's when they gave it to us.
You didn't receive the toxicology screening until August 22nd.
That's right, ma'am. That's when the police gave it to us.
And the autopsy and the toxicology report, well, they confirmed that your grandmother did die from chlorandramine poisoning, right?
Yes, ma'am, they did. My grandmother has a fatal allergic reaction to chlorandramine, so I don't understand how she ended up taking it.
And Ms. Rogers, on August 23rd, the police found a copy of Death in a Bottle with a bookmark in it in your room, right?
Yes, ma'am. That was the book that I was reading. It was the one that my grandmother said I should read.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
They were redirect of this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right. We can move on to the second witness then.
Yes, Your Honor. This time the plaintiff calls M. Bond to the stand.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you state your name for the court?
Good morning. I'm Mary Bond.
Miss Bond, what do you do for a living?
I'm a licensed private investigator here in Midlands.
What do you do as a private investigator?
Essentially, I'm hired to conduct additional research alongside the police department. So I investigate crime scenes, collect evidence, interview witnesses, and I try to answer questions that the police might not be able to.
Well, ma'am, how are you involved in today's case?
I was hired by Stevie Rogers to look into the death of her grandmother, Agatha Lee, and so I worked alongside the police throughout their investigation.
Well, how did you begin your investigation?
Stevie Rogers called me the morning that her grandmother died, and so I went straight to the Lee Manor. There I found Stevie Rogers, Drew Mars, and, of course, Miss Lee's body.
Now, ma'am, when you found Miss Lee's body, what did you and police investigators do?
So the first thing we did was try to figure out cause of death. And here that was a little bit difficult because there were no visible wounds or bruising.
Well, did you ever find out Miss Lee's cause of death?
Yes. The coroner eventually conducted a full autopsy, which I had access to, which confirmed the cause of Miss Lee's death.
Miss Meta, can we see that autopsy report, please? Investigator, what are we looking at here?
This is that autopsy report.
And according to this report, what was Agatha Lee's cause of death?
So as you can see, Miss Lee had a fatal allergic reaction to a drug called chlorandramine.
Can you tell the members of the jury what's chlorandramine?
Sure. It's a very common heartburn pill. It's available over the counter at most pharmacies. I've taken it a few times myself. But according to the autopsy, Miss Lee was extremely allergic to the drug.
So if Agatha Lee was allergic to chlorandramine, I want to talk about how that drug could have ended up in her body. How did you go about investigating that question?
Right. So when I was examining Ms. Lee's medications, I found that her daily arthritis pill was exactly identical in size, shape, and color to chlorandramine. So from there, we began to investigate whether or not somebody could have swapped the two pills.
Well, at that point, did you have any suspects?
I did. Now, there were no signs of forced entry to the house. I mean, no broken windows or picked locks. So my two suspects were the two people who told me that they were in the Lee Manor the night that Miss Lee died. That's Stevie Rogers and Drew Mars.
Ma'am, I want to take those people one at a time. Can you tell the members of the jury who is Drew Mars?
Drew Mars told me that he was Miss Lee's primary caretaker.
And why did you suspect the defendant?
There's two things. First of all, I found that the defendant had access to Miss Lee's medications. In fact, he told me that he was responsible for administering her daily medications. Second, I found that the defendant had the means and the opportunity to access chlorandramine the day that Miss Lee died.
Well, ma'am, let's break that down. How exactly did the defendant have access to chlorandramine?
Like I said, chlorandramine is available over the counter at many pharmacies. Now, the defendant admitted to the police that he went to a pharmacy alone just hours before Miss Lee died. And he also couldn't provide an explanation or any receipt as to why he was at the pharmacy that day.
Now, ma'am, you just told us the defendant had access to chlorandramine. Did you find any evidence that he was in possession of chlorandramine?
Yes, we found a bag of chlorandramine pills in the defendant's closet. We took some photographs of the bag and where it was found.
Would you recognize those photographs in court today?
Yes, I'm sure I would.
Now, investigator, what are we looking at here?
Those are the photographs that we took inside the Lee Manor.
Are they fair and accurate copies of those photographs?
Yes, they appear to be so.
Have they been changed or altered in any way?
No, it doesn't look like it.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff moves exhibits 14, 15, and 17 into evidence.
Defense, any objections?
No objections, Your Honor.
All right, without objection, they'll be so admitted.
Now, ma'am, you told us that this bag was found in the defendant's room. Where exactly in his room did you find it?
We found the bag inside the defendant's closet. It was tucked away under that gray blanket that you can see.
Now, ma'am, did you find any evidence that the defendant had touched that bag that you found the pills in?
Yes. After finding the bag in the defendant's room, we of course tested the bag for fingerprints. And we did find a partial fingerprint on the bag zipper that belonged to the defendant.
Now, ma'am, before you told us that Stevie Rogers was also a suspect in your investigation, did you find any evidence that Stevie Rogers was in possession of chlorandramine?
No, we didn't find that Stevie Rogers possessed any chlorandramine.
Now, ma'am, before you told us you found a bag in the defendant's room that had his fingerprint on it, did you find Stevie Rogers' fingerprint on that bag?
No, we didn't find Stevie Rogers' fingerprint on the bag.
Did you find anyone else's fingerprint on that bag besides the defendant's?
No, the only fingerprints on the bag belonged to Drew Mars.
Ma'am, I want to shift gears and talk about how the defendant acted after Agatha Lee's death. Ms. Mehta, can we see the timeline again, please? And Your Honor, just for the court's reference, I've redacted the portions that Ms. Rogers had testified about beforehand as to not violate 615.
Thank you.
Now, ma'am, did you find any evidence that the defendant would benefit if Miss Lee ever died?
Yes, actually. I was present at the will reading, where it was announced that Mr. Mars was to inherit the entirety of Miss Lee's fortune.
When the defendant heard that information, how did he react?
Well, he stood up, he gasped, he put his hands over his mouth, and he said, "I cannot believe it. I had no idea." And then he left the room.
Ma'am, when did that will reading take place?
It was August 20th, 2018.
Well, did you find any evidence that suggested the defendant knew about the inheritance before the will reading?
Yes. So I conducted a search of the defendant's computer where I found an email which suggested that the defendant knew about the changes to the will 6 months before Agatha's death.
Would you recognize that email in court today?
Yes, I would.
Ms. Mena, can we see the email, please? Now, investigator, what are we looking at here?
This is the email that I was just talking about.
Is it a fair and accurate copy of that email?
Yes?
Has it been changed or altered in any way?
No, it hasn't.
Your Honor, this time the plaintiff moves Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objections from the defense?
No objections, Your Honor.
All right, without objection, it'll be admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, ma'am, you just told us this email suggested to you that the defendant knew about the will before the will reading. What exactly does it say?
It says, Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me. I get everything. The house, the money, everything. We're talking millions of dollars. This is going to totally change my life.
And ma'am, when did the defendant send this email?
It's dated February 1st, 2018. And that's 6 months before the defendant said, I have no idea.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. We have no further questions at this time, Your Honor. And Ms. Mena, you can take down the timeline. Thank you.
All right, defense, whenever you're ready for your cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Bond, I want to start off by talking to you about how you came to be in today's trial, okay?
Of course, go ahead.
Now, in August of 2018, on the 15th, you were hired by the plaintiff to investigate Miss Lee's death, correct?
Yes, of course.
And obviously, you're going to get paid for that work.
Yes, I'm a private investigator. I don't work for free. I am paid for my work.
So I want to turn your attention to the phone call of August 15th that morning. The plaintiff did call you, isn't that right?
Yes, I did receive a call that morning, and afterwards I went straight to the Lee Manor.
And before you got to the Lee Manor, on that phone call, the plaintiff told you that Miss Lee had passed away.
Yes, that is what Miss Rogers said.
Specifically, the plaintiff told you that Miss Lee had been, quote, murdered. Isn't that right?
Yes, Stevie said Nana had been murdered.
Now, just like you said a few seconds ago, you eventually made it to Lee Manor that day.
Yes, I got there around 9:25 in the morning.
Right, and about 5 minutes after you got there, a detective showed up.
Yes, Detective Khan showed up just after I did.
So to be clear, at the time you arrived, there were no police on the premises.
Yes, I got there just before the police.
I now want to shift your attention to 10 o'clock that morning. The four of you, and by the four I mean yourself, the plaintiff, Drew Mars, and the detective,
Yes.
gathered in Miss Lee's study, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And while in that study, you all had a discussion about what to do with Miss Lee's body.
Yes, exactly.
And I want to focus on what happened in that discussion. The
Sure.
plaintiff was demanding an autopsy, correct?
Yes, at this point, Stevie Rogers and Mr. Mars got into a little bit of an argument. Drew had wanted to cremate Miss Lee's body, versus Stevie wanted a toxicology screen.
So, Ms. Bond, I'll bring you back to the question. It was very specific. The plaintiff was demanding an autopsy, right?
Yes, she was.
And the plaintiff was also demanding a tox screen, correct?
Yes.
The only person making those demands was the plaintiff, right?
Yes, that's true.
Now, on August 15th, while you were there, you also pulled Drew Mars aside, correct?
Yes, I did. We had a chat.
And you also asked Drew Mars if you could search his room.
Yes, I asked if I could search his room, and he said that he would rather not.
But you never asked to search the plaintiff's room, did you?
No, the police searched the plaintiff's room.
But you never asked, did you?
No, the police did that.
Now, I want to turn your attention to the search you did do of Drew Mars's room. You did that while Drew Mars was talking to the detective, correct?
Yes, that's when I searched Drew's room, and that's when I found the email that I was just talking about.
Right, you were in that room alone,
Yes, I was.
Nobody there to see what you were doing.
No, there wasn't.
Now I want to turn your attention to August 21st. That's the day you received the autopsy report, right?
Yes, that's the day we went back to the Lee Manor to do an additional search.
Your Honor, showing Exhibit 2 has been pre-admitted. Miss Bond, this is that same autopsy report you were shown on direct examination, correct?
Yes, that's it.
And you'd agree with me that on this autopsy report, the medical examiner determined that the sole and conclusive cause of death was a fatal allergic reaction to chlorandramine.
Yes, exactly. Like I said, Miss Lee was extremely allergic to the drug, and it was what caused her death.
And you'd also agree with me that the date of this autopsy is August 21st.
Yes, that's correct.
And so now I want to turn your attention to the other thing you did on August 21st. You went back to Lee Manor with the detective, right?
Yes, I did.
And you two searched the house, isn't that right?
Yes, and that was when we found the bag of chlorandramine pills in the defendant's closet.
Right, and I want to talk about that because this was the second time you found yourself in Drew Mars's room.
Yes, of course, as part of my investigation, yes.
And it was during this second search where you found that bag.
Yes, that's correct.
And it was during this second search when you found those pills.
Yes, exactly. We found the pills on the 21st.
And I want to remind you, take you back to August 15th when you searched Drew Mars's room alone. You didn't find that bag, did you?
No, at that time I wasn't looking for any pills. We weren't positive how Agatha had died, so at that point we weren't yet looking for a murder weapon.
So the answer to my question is no, you didn't find that bag.
No, at that point we weren't looking for any pills or any murder weapon at that point.
So also on August 15th, when you searched that room alone, you didn't find any chlorandramine pills, did you?
No, again, I wasn't looking for anything specific.
Now, you talked about a fingerprint you found, correct?
Yes, correct. A fingerprint on the zipper of the bag.
Right, it's a fingerprint, correct?
Yes, we were only able to find one usable fingerprint.
So there were other unusable fingerprints you couldn't identify, right?
There were smudges.
And you can't say whether or not those belonged to the plaintiff, can you?
No, the only fingerprint that we found on the bag belonged to the defendant.
Now, you'd agree with me that it's nearly impossible to open a bag with a zipper using one finger, right?
Sure.
Now, Ms. Bond, I want to talk about the evidence you claim to have against Drew Mars. Your Honor, permission for my co-counsel to display demonstrative.
Sure.
You talked about who knew of Ms. Lee's chlorandramine allergy, right?
Yes, of course.
And you mentioned that Drew Mars knew about that.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to investigate Mr. Mars as a suspect.
It's also true the plaintiff had that same knowledge.
Yes, that's why I also investigated Stevie as a suspect. However, I didn't find any evidence that...
Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive.
What was the question?
The plaintiff had that same knowledge.
I'm going to overrule that objection. She can give the answer.
So like I was saying, I didn't find any evidence that Miss Rogers knew that the chlorandramine pills were identical to Agatha's arthritis medication, nor that she was in possession of any chlorandramine.
Well, that's not what I asked you, Ms. Bond. The answer to my question of whether or not the plaintiff knew of the allergy is yes, correct?
Yes.
And I want to turn your attention to another piece of evidence you talked about. Who had access to Miss Lee's pills on August 14th? You testified Drew Mars had access.
Yes, that's correct.
It's also true to the best of your knowledge that the plaintiff had access.
Sure, I think it's possible.
And I want to turn your attention now to who had access to Drew Mars's room. Obviously, you had access, correct?
Yes, I did.
And to the best of your knowledge, the plaintiff would have the same access.
Yes, but this was a crucial determining factor between Drew Mars and Stevie Rogers. The problem is that
Objection,
Drew Mars' fingerprints...
Response,
again, what plaintiff, go ahead and respond.
Your Honor, I believe the investigator was commenting on opposing counsel's question. It's proper for the investigator to offer some opinion on what opposing counsel is asking her.
Response, Your Honor.
You can give a brief response.
The question was specifically to the best of her knowledge that the plaintiff had access to Drew Mars's room. This witness has said, yes, it's possible, and then proceeded to talk about a factor that I didn't ask about.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to overrule that objection. She can give that answer. And just so we're clear for in the future, attorneys, rather than cutting off the witness, I'd prefer it if after the witness gives the answer, you move to strike for non-responsive rather than objecting to it, just so we don't have this crosstalk with the Zoom platform. Okay, then you can continue.
Thank you. So what I was saying is that the problem is that Drew's fingerprints are on the bag, not Stevie's, which is why I ruled out Stevie Rogers, despite having access to the room.
I want to turn your attention to another piece of evidence you spoke about.
Of course.
Who had access to Miss Lee's room? Now, you testify that Drew Mars had that access as her caretaker.
Yes, sir. I believe they both had access to Miss Lee's room.
And it's true also, to the best of your knowledge, the plaintiff had the same access.
Yes.
And you also are familiar with the search of August 21st, right?
Yes, I am.
And you're aware that the detective found one copy of Death in a Bottle in the plaintiff's room.
Yes, the police found the novel in the room.
Now, Ms. Bond, you talked a lot on direct examination about the will that Drew Mars is named in, right?
Yes, of course. The will which names Drew Mars as the sole inheritor of Agatha's estate.
And to you, that would be motive for Drew Mars.
Certainly, yes.
But you also mentioned the other suspect you briefly considered was the plaintiff, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you also acknowledge the possibility the plaintiff had motive, don't you?
Yes, of course, that's very possible.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Any redirect for this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor. We just ask the witness be excused.
Yes, she'll be excused. Okay, and I believe that takes us into our 5-minute break. Judges, please remember that this video is publicly broadcast via YouTube live stream. Competitors, will see you shortly.
I am showing that we are at 5 minutes. Judges, before I bring the students back in, if you could either very quickly turn on your camera or send me a message just to confirm that you're back. Okay, I believe we are all here. Let me get the students back then. All right, Judge Furlani, I believe we are ready to proceed.
All right, if we're ready to proceed, defense, you can go ahead and call your first witness.
The defense calls Drew Mars. May I proceed?
Yes.
Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Mr. Mars, you're muted.
Oh, my apologies, Your Honor. My name is Andrew Mars.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a registered nurse. I usually work in physical therapy or recovery, end-of-life care. Recently, though, I've been doing a lot more volunteer work at local urgent care centers.
Mr. Mars, you've been here throughout the course of today's trial. I have to ask you, did you kill Agatha Lee?
No, of course not. I was her caretaker for a decade. We were like family. Of course, I could never.
Okay, Mr. Mars, let's start by talking about Stevie Rogers. Do you know who that person is?
Yes, Stevie is Agatha's granddaughter. I'm her only one.
When did you first meet Miss Rogers?
When I started working for Agatha back in 2008.
Did you see Miss Rogers often?
Yes, she would come and stay with us during the summers. Back then, even Stevie would call or write to Agatha all the time.
You said back then Miss Rogers would call or write. Did that ever change?
Yes, right when Stevie's mom died, Veronica. The death was really hard on Agatha. She couldn't sleep, eat, she couldn't function. And then Stevie just stopped visiting, stopped calling.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation.
Defense?
To what part specifically?
Plaintiff, please explain your objection a little bit further.
Yes, Your Honor. This witness just testified that Stevie Rogers stopped calling Agatha. We haven't heard any foundation as to how he would know she was never calling Agatha Lee. We know they lived together, but that's certainly not enough foundation to know for him to testify he knows what calls were being made to her phone throughout that entire 7-year period.
Defense, your response?
Yep. Yes, Mr. Mars didn't testify that Stevie never called. He testified that from what he remembered, she'd stopped calling, which was a contrast from what he remembered prior when she called and wrote often. We know that he lived with her for a decade, and the difference between someone calling once a week to calling rarely is something that he has the foundation to testify to.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, last word.
Well, if the foundation, Ms. Bianchi just said that it went from once a week to never, if that's the truth, that he used to hear those frequent calls and then he stopped hearing them, we need to hear that foundation. Ms. Bianchi just said it, but the witness didn't.
Yeah, I agree with you, plaintiff, so I'm going to sustain that objection. Defense, please lay the foundation before you get into that testimony.
Move to strike
Yes,
until the foundation is laid, Your Honor.
Yes, move to strike granted.
Mr. Mars, earlier you mentioned that back then you remember Miss Rogers calling often. Did that ever change?
Yes. Like I was saying, after Stevie's mom died, Agatha said she had stopped hearing from Stevie entirely.
Your Honor, at this point, I would re-raise my objection to hearsay. Amend my objection, excuse me, to hearsay. That the statement that the witness just offered as foundation is a statement by Agatha Lee. That's hearsay.
And can someone remind me of the statement?
Yes, Your Honor. I believe it was that Agatha told me Stevie wasn't calling anymore, something to that effect.
Okay. Defense, your response?
Your Honor, I'll rephrase the question.
Okay, then we will strike the hearsay statement from the record.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Mars, from 2008 until 2018, how many times do you remember seeing Miss Rogers?
Maybe 2. I know for sure she hadn't visited, or I hadn't seen her in the house since 2011.
From 2011 to 2018, do you remember Miss Rogers calling Miss Lee?
I remember a few calls. Again, I didn't hear any of those calls or know of any calls since 2011.
Okay. Mr. Mars, let's shift to talking about one day in particular, August 14th, 2018. We've heard an awful lot about that day already. Can you tell us how that day began for you?
It began a bit differently than usual. Normally, I would make breakfast for Agatha, but that morning, Stevie had made breakfast. The two of them were talking in Agatha's study all morning.
Did you hear what they were talking about?
Yes. Around 11, I went upstairs and I was standing outside the door to the study when I overheard them.
Mr. McCurdy, would you mind displaying what's already been entered into evidence as Exhibit 5? It's a map of the second floor of Miss Lee's mansion. Mr. Mars, where were you standing when you overheard this conversation on August 14th?
I was standing in the sitting area, right outside of the doors to Agatha's study. Agatha and Stevie were inside of the study.
Let the record reflect that we're placing a red dot outside the doors to the study. Mr. Mars, is that where you were standing?
Yes, it was.
While you were standing there, what did you hear?
Well, I heard Stevie ask whether Agatha would update her will to include Stevie in it again, since she had shown how devoted a granddaughter she was.
How did Miss Lee respond when Miss Rogers asked about the will?
She said she loved Stevie, loved having her around, but she wasn't going to change her will. She said she wanted Stevie to stand on her own 2 feet.
What happened after you overheard that conversation?
Well, Agatha left the study. She had a lunch meeting with her biographer, Ryan Cabrera. Stevie was with her, but she didn't say anything to me until Agatha was out of earshot.
What did Miss Rogers say?
She looked at me and just said, "Don't count your millions yet."
After Miss Rogers told you not to count your millions yet, did you see her again?
Yes, I saw her again when I dropped off dinner for Agatha and Stevie. It was around 6 p.m. that evening in their study. After that, I just cleaned up dinner and went to bed. It was the last time I saw Stevie and Agatha that day.
Okay. Mr. Mars, let's then move to the next day, August 15th. How'd that day begin for you?
It started like usual. I prepared Agatha some coffee and went to take it to her. But when I walked into her room, she wasn't awake.
What did you see?
I saw her lying in her bed. I tried waking her up, but she wasn't moving.
Did you say anything?
I don't know. I tried, but she wasn't responding to me. I was trying to get her up, but Agatha was dead.
What did you do?
I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled my way over to Stevie's room to tell her, and then I just fell to the floor, and I don't think I got up until police officers arrived.
Mr. Mars, today we've heard a lot about a drug called chloroandramine. Did you ever purchase that drug?
No, never.
Did you ever put chloroandramine in Miss Lee's pill organizer?
No, she was allergic to it. I would never do that.
Did you have chloroandramine in your closet on August 14th?
No, I never even bought it. I don't know how that got there.
Well, Mr. Mars, do you know if chloroandramine is easy to purchase?
It's over the counter, so it's sold at most pharmacies.
Did you ever leave Miss Lee's mansion on August 14th?
Yes, with Agatha Lee for that lunch meeting.
When you left the house, was Stevie Rogers inside?
Yes, when we both left, Stevie, she stayed home.
To your knowledge, did anyone else have access to the Lee mansion on August 14th, 2018?
As far as I know, the only people with keys were those of us who were living there. So that would have just been me, Agatha, and Stevie.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay, plaintiff, whenever you're ready, you can proceed to cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Hi, Mr. Mars. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Can you see and hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Sir, I want to start off by talking about Agatha's will. Now, in early of 2018, you found out you were going to be in Agatha's will. Is that right?
Yes, Agatha told me she was changing her will.
You found out that you were going to inherit the house, right?
Yes, she told me I was inheriting everything of hers.
That's right. You'd inherit the rights to her famous book, right?
Yes.
And sir, you'd also inherit $20 million in cash. Is that right?
Yes.
In fact, sir, at the time that she told you about this, you thought you were inheriting more than $20 million. Is that right?
Right. I didn't know how much Agatha was worth.
Well, sir, you needed that money, didn't you?
Not personally needed that money. Agatha was paying me very well, though my family didn't have much money, if that's what you mean.
Well, Mr. Mars, I want to be clear. You had a family member who was sick. Is that right?
My sister did get sick back in 2018, yes.
In your own words, your family needed Agatha's money, right?
Yes, and like I said, that's why I was sending home all of the paychecks Agatha was giving me.
Well, sir, I want to be clear. You said that your family needed the money you would get from Agatha's estate, right?
Yes.
You thought that Agatha's estate money would change your life.
Well, of course, I didn't come from much, and she was a millionaire.
Sir, you heard Stevie Rogers testify earlier today, didn't you?
I did. I've been here all of today.
You heard her talk about a conversation she had with her grandmother, right?
Yes, she did talk about that.
She said Agatha decided she was going to change her will, leave the money to Stevie instead of to you, right?
That's what Stevie was telling you today, yes.
Mr. Nybart, could we get that timeline back on the screen? And let's focus in on the 14th. Thank you. Now, sir, you're claiming that's not what Agatha said in that conversation. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's not what I heard her say.
Okay, I want to talk about what you did immediately after that conversation. You got in your car, right?
Yes, I took Agatha over to her lunch meeting.
And after you took Agatha to lunch, you went to a pharmacy. Is that right?
I'm an in-home caretaker, yes.
Sir, you went to a pharmacy, is that right?
Yes, like I said.
Sir, when you walked into that pharmacy on August 14th, you knew that Agatha was allergic to chloroandramine, right?
Of course, as her caretaker, I knew all of her medications and allergies.
You knew that chloroandramine was available over the counter?
Yes.
Sir, you're claiming you didn't buy chloroandramine that day. Do I have that right?
I didn't, no.
You know that a bag was found in your closet containing chloroandramine, right?
I know that Stevie's private investigator found that bag, yes.
The police told you they found that bag, didn't they?
The police in the report said that it was found, yes.
The police, they later asked you about that bag specifically, didn't they?
They did.
They asked you, have you ever touched this bag that has chloroandramine in it, right?
They did.
You said never.
Right, it's not my bag. I don't remember ever seeing it. No.
Sir, that's a yes to my question. You told the police never. You had never touched that bag.
Yes.
You know your fingerprint was found on that bag. Is that right?
That's what the private investigator said today, yes.
Sir, I want to talk about what happened after Agatha Lee died. Now, you were at the will reading, weren't you?
I was.
You were there with Agatha's family and friends, right?
Her granddaughter was the only other person there, besides the investigator and the attorney.
Sir, you heard the attorney read that Agatha's will was going to be given to you. Is that right?
Her will said her estate would be given to me, yes.
That's right. You heard the attorney say that, didn't you?
Yes.
And sir, when you heard that, you stood up, right?
Right. I said, I think I can't believe it, and walked out.
Well, sir, you put your hands over your mouth, right?
Yes, I did.
And then to be clear, you said, I can't believe it. I had no idea. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's what I said.
You said that over and over again?
Yes, I did.
And then, like you said, you walked out of the room, right?
Yes, like I said.
Mr. Mars, that was a lie, wasn't it?
I did know, if that's what you mean, yes.
That's right. You found out about the will back in February. Isn't that right?
Yes, like we've talked about.
Mr. Nybart, could we get Exhibit 13 on the screen? Sir, this is an email that you wrote. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
You wrote this months before the will reading, right?
Yes, back in February.
Back in February before Agatha Lee died. Is that right?
Yes.
Sir, months before you said, I had no idea. You wrote, I get everything, right?
Yes, I did.
Objection, Your Honor. Cumulative. May I be heard?
Sure.
This exhibit is already in evidence, for one. And secondly, the plaintiff has already walked through each of these statements with Ms. Bond, who already testified. And Mr. Mars was here when she testified. At this point, this is the third time that the plaintiff is going through these exact statements, and it's cumulative.
Plaintiff, your response?
Yes, Your Honor. First of all, the only witness we've heard talk about this is Ms. Bond. Stevie Rogers did not testify to this email. Furthermore, Your Honor, it's important to confront the defendant in this case with evidence of his lie, like he just admitted to. We're using it for that purpose. It's important for the jury to hear what the defendant has to say about this evidence, as it is his trial.
I am going to overrule the objection. Plaintiff, you're free to ask about this email.
Sir, months before you said, I had no idea, you wrote, I get the house, the money, everything. Is that right?
Yes, that's what I wrote in this email.
You said this is going to totally change my life.
Yes, I did.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, nothing further at this time.
Any redirect of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Mars, you were asked some questions about a black bag that was found in your closet. I'm displaying what's been entered into evidence as Exhibit 14. Mr. Mars, is this a photograph that you've seen before?
Yes, it's the picture of my closet.
You were here when Ms. Bond testified that this was what your closet looked like when she took the photograph, right?
Yes.
Do you remember when Ms. Bond said she found that black bag in your closet?
August 21st, the second time that Stevie's private investigator came into my room.
Do you remember when she said the first time she went into your room was?
August 15th, the day that we had found Agatha dead.
Did you see this black bag in your closet on August 15th?
No,
Did you ever see it before August 21st?
no, I'd never seen it.
Had you ever touched this bag before?
No, like I said, I hadn't. I don't know how that fingerprint got there.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, this witness is excused.
No recross, Your Honor.
All right. I'm going to give our scoring judges just a moment to fill in their online ballots. All right, defense, whenever you're ready, please call your second witness.
Defense calls Ryan Cabrera, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
Can you introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, I'm Ryan Cabrera.
Miss Cabrera, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a writer. I wanted to be a news reporter, but after my 300th letter to the New York Times, they asked me to stop calling. Now I write biographies.
Miss Cabrera, I want to turn your attention to today's case. Can you tell us how you got involved?
Of course. Well, Drew called me in about June and asked me to testify.
You mentioned that Drew Mars called you. How do you know him?
I was writing a biography for Agatha. Drew was sometimes there in the background erasing his Sudoku answers.
Now, you mentioned an Agatha. Who is that, Miss Cabrera?
Well, that's Agatha Lee. She's one of America's best storytellers. Kind of like J.K. Rowling, but less controversial.
Now, Miss Cabrera, you mentioned that you were working on her biography. Can you tell us how that came to be?
Well, I hit rock bottom. I ended up having to write a biography of the Taco Bell Chihuahua. It's not something I'm proud of. And I wanted to start my career again, so I wrote Agatha a letter asking if I could write about her.
Miss Cabrera, when was the first time you got a chance to meet Miss Agatha Lee?
Well, that was in February of 2018. I drove out to Lee Manor to meet Agatha.
Now, how often did you and Miss Lee work together on her biography before she passed away?
There was a couple times every week for about 6 months.
Can you tell us where those meetings would usually take place?
Sure, they'd sometimes be at Agatha's house, Lee Manor, or at a restaurant she liked to go to.
Miss Cabrera, can you tell the members of the jury what you two would often talk about during those meetings?
Sure, we talk about normal biographer interview things, her childhood, how she grew up, what it was like being Agatha Lee.
Now, Miss Cabrera, you mentioned that you would often meet at Lee Manor. Was anyone else living there that you saw?
Yes, Drew was living there, her caretaker.
Did you ever get a chance to see the two of them interact?
Yeah, Drew was sometimes around when I was doing my interviews.
Miss Cabrera, how would you describe the interactions between Drew Mars and Miss Lee?
They seemed like grandmother and grandson, always laughing, smiling. Seemed like they got along.
And did Miss Lee ever say anything about Drew Mars?
She did. A couple months before she died, she told me she was going to leave everything to Drew.
I want to shift your attention now to the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers. During your time with Miss Lee, did she ever mention the plaintiff?
She did.
Miss Cabrera, when was the last time Miss Lee mentioned Stevie Rogers?
That was the day before Agatha died.
and what happened that day when she mentioned Stevie.
That was our last meeting together. We went out to Stupendous Steaks for lunch, and she told me she had a conversation with Stevie and hoped she'd be forgiven. I didn't ask her about anything further.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Defense, your response.
Yes, Your Honor. For the part where Ms. Lee says she had a conversation with the plaintiff, that part has already been testified to through multiple witnesses in this case, namely the plaintiff and Drew Mars. It's already on the record. For the part where Ms. Lee says she hoped she'd be forgiven for it, the defense argues that under 8033, that is a then existing emotional condition, and that Ms. Lee was expressing some level of angst or regret.
Plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. They're certainly using that statement that Ms. Lee did in fact have a conversation with Stevie Rogers for the truth of the matter asserted. The defendant previously testified that the conversation went a certain way, that Ms. Lee told Stevie Rogers that she wasn't going to give him, wasn't going to name him in her will or give her inheritance. Therefore, they are trying to offer this fact for the truth of the matter asserted.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Just 1 second. To the second part of the conversation where defense counsel has asserted 8033 as the exception, do you have any response for that?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff's fine with the second half of the statement, Your Honor. It's that first part that we have an issue with. The defense is offering.
All right, I'm not sure if anyone else, your video cut out for a second there for me. Can you continue with your objection? We had a bit of a technical glitch there.
Of course, Your Honor. The plaintiff has no issue with the second part of that statement. It's just that first part that we have an issue with. That's hearsay, Your Honor.
Okay, so just the conversation piece. Okay, yes, defense, please respond.
Well, once again, this has already been testified to, and it's my understanding here that neither party is contesting the fact that on the morning of August 15th, both the plaintiff and Ms. Rogers had a conversation. Now, this statement doesn't go into what that conversation was about. It's just that they had a conversation, a fact that's been testified to. And furthermore, Your Honor, if opposing counsel would like a limiting instruction for this specific statement to not be taken for the truth of the matter, but just to show Ms. Lee's next statement, we're fine with that.
Plaintiff, do you have anything further?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff believes that the defense is trying to offer this statement to bolster what their previous witness testified to beforehand. Drew Mars just testified that Agatha had a conversation with Stevie where she told Stevie she wasn't going to include her in the will. Therefore, using this statement for this witness is trying to bolster that fact, and they're offering it for its truth. We don't simply agree with Mr. McCurdy that they're not offering for this statement for the truth of the matter asserted.
I am going to sustain the objection, and that'll be stricken from the record.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
So, Ms. Cabrera, after Ms. Lee had told you she hoped she'd be forgiven for what happened, did you ever see her after lunch?
No, that was the last time I saw her.
I want to turn your attention to August 15th, the next day. Did you ever hear from Drew Mars?
I did. Drew called me up on the phone. He was sobbing. I could barely understand him, but he said Agatha was gone.
Ms. Cabrera, I want to turn your attention to Ms. Lee's book, Death in a Bottle. Are you familiar with the plot of it?
I am.
Can you tell us what happens in that story?
Well, sure. In the book, there's an old woman who dies. The police, they think it's natural causes until they find out she was poisoned with chloroandramine. At the end of the book, there's this huge twist. I don't want to give any spoilers.
Objection, Your Honor, to needlessly cumulative. May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, I believe this is the second or third time that we've heard about this exhibit and heard about the plot of Miss Lee's book, Death in a Bottle. This witness can't offer any more information that we haven't already heard on the record. Therefore, her testimony is needlessly cumulative.
Response, Your Honor?
Please.
To my knowledge, the plaintiff did not testify about the plot of the book. Detective Bond did not testify about the plot of the book. Drew Mars did not testify about the plot of the book. The only time we've heard about the plot of the book is in opening statements. And as we all know, Your Honor, opening statements are not evidence. This is not cumulative.
Plaintiff, your response?
Yes, Your Honor, this exhibit has already been pre-admitted. It's in evidence. This witness simply reading from the exhibit and telling us about the plot of the story doesn't add anything to the record. It's just cumulative and it's not necessary for today.
I'm going to overrule this objection. The witness can go ahead and testify about it.
So, Ms. Cabrera, how exactly does this book end?
Well, throughout the entire book, everyone thinks it's this caretaker who's the one who killed the old woman. But in the end, you find out it was the grandson.
Ms. Cabrera, are you familiar with Exhibit 6, the police report in this case?
Yes, I am.
Showing the witness, Exhibit 6, Your Honor, it's been pre-admitted. Is this that police report you're familiar with?
Yes, it is.
Can you read line 25 to us?
It says, we searched Roger's bedroom. We found a copy of Death in a Bottle next to the bed, dog-eared about 10 pages before the end. No evidence was collected from Roger's bedroom.
Ms. Cabrera, are there any similarities between the book and today's case?
As far as I know, there are some similarities. Everyone thinking, including myself, Agatha died of natural causes. We find out it's chlorandramine. Everyone thinks the caretaker has done it.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay, plaintiff, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and cross-examine.
Yes, Your Honor. Proceed.
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Now, ma'am, you just talked about a conversation you overheard in August of 2018. I want to talk about a conversation you heard in May of that same year, all right?
All right.
Now, in May of 2018, you saw the defendant walk into Agatha Lee's room, right?
Yeah, he was giving Agatha her pills.
That's right. The defendant had a glass of water in one hand and a pill in the other hand, right?
That's right.
As he was handing Miss Lee that glass of water and that pill, he started telling Miss Lee what he was giving her. He started describing that pill, right?
Yeah, and Agatha said, oh, you don't need to bother. I'll take whatever you give me.
That's right. Miss Lee stopped the defendant and said, you know I'll take whatever you hand me. She said that, right?
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
Okay, plaintiff, your response?
Well, I have a two-part response, Your Honor. First and foremost, the witness actually testified to that statement beforehand. We're just clarifying for the jury what the witness just said. Secondly, we're not offering the statement for its truth. Simply that the defendant heard this statement, believed it to be true, and then acted in accordance with that belief later on. We're not offering for its truth, but rather the effect it had on the listener, that being the defendant.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes, please.
The audio cut out, so I'm not sure if Ms. Cabrera did testify to that fact. But if she did, I would withdraw the objection. Is that the case, Your Honor?
I did hear her say that. You're going to withdraw the objection?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Then please continue.
And just to clarify for the members of the jury, Miss Lee stopped the defendant and said, you know I'll take whatever you hand me. She said that, right?
She did.
And ma'am, I want to talk about your relationship with Agatha Lee. You were writing a biography about her, right?
I was.
So ma'am, of course you know that at age 32, Miss Lee wrote a book called Death in a Bottle, right?
Yeah, one of the best mystery books of our time.
And that book was pretty popular, right?
I'd count pretty popular. It sold millions of copies.
That's right, ma'am. It sold 65 million copies worldwide, right?
That sounds right, yeah.
You'd agree with me that you believe that Agatha never wrote another book, right?
Well, I thought that before, but at our last meeting, Agatha actually told me that wasn't true.
Well, ma'am, when you first met Miss Lee, you thought she never wrote another story after Death in a Bottle, right?
Yeah, back in February of 2018.
And you actually wondered why Miss Lee never wrote another story, right?
I mean, yeah, her voice was just so effective in communicating mystery stories.
You thought that if she wrote another story and she tried selling that story, it would be pretty popular too, right?
I think so. I'd buy a copy.
So, ma'am, finally on August 14th of 2018, you asked Miss Lee why she never wrote another book, right?
I did.
And Miss Lee told you that she had written other books, but she just never published them, right?
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
And if your response?
Yes, Your Honor, we're not offering the statement for its truth. We're not trying to assert that Miss Lee actually had other books written and that she never published them, but rather the effect it had on the listener. That Ms. Cabrera heard this statement and believed it to be true.
Okay. Defense, please respond.
Yes, Your Honor. May I make an offer of proof?
Yes.
It's the defense's belief that opposing counsel is going to use this statement to show that Ms. Cabrera may be testifying in this case because she wants unpublished books. They have to establish that there were, in fact, unpublished books to be gained from Ms. Lee. They are using this statement to prove the truth of the matter within that statement, that Ms. Lee had other books she did not publish.
Response to that, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, we're not trying to assert that Ms. Lee actually had other books written and that they were never published, but rather that this witness heard that information, believed it to be true, and is now testifying in accordance with that belief. We're not offering the statement for its truth, but rather the effect it had on this witness, Ms. Cabrera.
Defense, any further response?
Yes, Your Honor, it's still being used for the truth of the matter asserted. They are asserting that there are books that exist that were unpublished for Ms. Cabrera to gain afterwards. That's using it for the truth of the matter asserted within that statement from Ms. Lee.
Response to that, Your Honor, briefly?
Do you have anything new to add that hasn't been said?
Well, just to reiterate, Your Honor, we don't actually care if Ms. Lee actually had other books written or
I'm going to stop you there. If we're reiterating, we don't need to keep going around in the same argument. If no one has anything new to add, I'll make my ruling. I am going to allow this testimony. So defense, your objection is overruled.
So, Ms. Cabrera, just to be clear, Ms. Lee told you that she had written other books, but they were never published, right?
She did.
Ma'am, you'd agree with me that those unpublished books, well, they're extremely valuable, right?
I'd say so, yes.
Ma'am, you can't even fathom how much those books would be worth, right?
I really can't, no.
Now, ma'am, I want to talk about why you're testifying here in court. Now, you're familiar with Agatha Lee's will, right?
Well, I am, but I'm not testifying because of her will.
But you're familiar with it, right?
I am.
Ms. Mehta, can we see that will? Now, ma'am, you're aware that Agatha Lee was leaving her entire estate, all real and personal property, to Drew Mars, the defendant, right?
Objection, Your Honor. May I be heard?
What's the grounds for your objection?
Opposing counsel is eliciting statements from a document that hasn't been authenticated or offered into evidence.
This is, what's the exhibit number?
Exhibit 9, Your Honor.
Okay, plaintiff, has this been entered into evidence?
We were under the impression that it was admitted on a previous witness, but if it wasn't, Your Honor, I believe both sides have stipulated to this document's authenticity and to the contents of it.
Response, Your Honor.
Sure.
Stipulating that it's authentic isn't the same as laying the foundation for this to be admitted as evidence. There is no pretrial order that pre-admits this. If opposing counsel wants to elicit statements from the exhibit, they should be required to go through the proper steps to introduce that into evidence.
Right. I don't recall this being entered. So plaintiff, why don't you go ahead and lay the foundation and offer it for evidence?
Certainly, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Cabrera, this is that will, right?
Yes, this is Agatha's will.
It's a fair and accurate copy of that will, right?
Yes.
It has not been changed or altered in any way, right?
It doesn't look like it, no.
Your Honor, this time the plaintiff moves this will into evidence.
Any objection, defense?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Then it'll be entered into evidence without objection.
Now, Ms. Cabrera, you were aware that Agatha Lee was leaving all real and personal property, her entire estate, to the defendant after she died, right?
Yes, that's what it says.
Ma'am, those unpublished books we just talked about a moment ago, they were included in Agatha Lee's real and personal property, right?
I guess so, yeah.
Ma'am, 2 months ago, the defendant actually called you on the phone, right?
She did.
Well, he asked you something pretty important, right?
Yeah, he asked if I would testify for him.
That's right. He wanted you to testify on his behalf, and you said yes, right?
I did.
Now, ma'am, right after you agreed to testify for the defendant, he asked you another question, right?
Yeah, a little while later, he asked me if I'd like something to remember Agatha by.
Actually, ma'am, right after you agreed to testify for him, he asked you another question, right? Directly after that, right?
Yeah, after I said, sure, I'll testify for you.
He asked you if you wanted anything of Agatha's, any of her belongings, right?
He did.
And you told the defendant you wanted those books, those unpublished novels, right?
I sure did.
And the defendant told you that if at the end of today's trial he still was in possession of those books, you could have them, right?
Yes.
Ma'am, you're aware that if Drew Mars loses this trial, he won't be in possession of those books, right?
I don't think so.
Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. We have no further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect for this witness?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Sure.
Ms. Cabrera, does the presence or absence of any unpublished books impact your testimony today?
No, that's why I told Drew I'd testify for him before those books ever came up.
No further questions, Your Honor. Assuming no recross examination, may this witness be excused.
Any recross?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right, then this witness may be excused.
Defense rests, Your Honor.
All right, and that should bring us into closing arguments. So,
Your Honor, a brief request from the plaintiff.
sure.
As you probably noticed, I've had some connectivity issues during the course of today's trial. I think I might have found a remedy. Can the plaintiff have 2 or 3 minutes to sort it out?
I have no problem with that as long as it's all right with the bailiff, then that's fine with me.
That's okay. We'll just, I think, wait in the courtroom with everybody muted as we are right now while plaintiff's attorney tries to sort out the technical issues.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, plaintiff ready to proceed.
Okay, so before we start closing arguments, if everyone can please switch back to speaker view. And then plaintiff, whenever you're ready, please proceed.
Your Honor, Mr. McCurdy, members of the jury. There have been a lot of things said from the beginning to the end of today's trial, but there was one moment that stood out to me in particular. Ms. Mehta's up here asking the defendant about the will reading, about when the defendant stood up and said, "I had no idea," and then stormed out of the room. She asked the defendant, "Did you lie at the will reading? Did you actually know?" And the defendant looked at us and he said, "I knew about it. I lied." And members of the jury, doesn't that just encapsulate today's case? Because on August 20th of 2018, the defendant didn't want people to know that he knew about Agatha Lee's inheritance. He didn't want people to know about his desperation for Agatha's money. He didn't want people to know about the drugs he used to kill her. Members of the jury, desperation, drugs, and the defendant's deceit. That's all this case comes down to. But before we talk about the evidence that points to the defendant, I want to talk about the law. Because today I heard the defendant, Drew Mars, was going to inherit Agatha Lee's entire fortune. That's nearly $20 million. But members of the jury in this state, if you kill someone, you can't inherit their money. It doesn't matter if you're in the will or not. And that's why Stevie Rogers has sued the defendant to stop Drew Mars from walking away with her grandmother's entire fortune. So as the plaintiff, we had to prove to you that Drew Mars purposely or knowingly killed Agatha Lee. In other words, that the defendant intentionally ended Agatha Lee's life. Now, members of the jury, you might have seen shows like Law and Order, where the attorneys, they have to prove their charges beyond a reasonable doubt, but this isn't a murder trial. We don't have to prove anything to you beyond a reasonable doubt. The only question you have to answer today is whether it's more likely than not that Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee. And members of the jury, the answer to that question is yes. Because when you go back to deliberate today, I want you to focus on three things: desperation, drugs, and deceit. Focus on the defendant's desperation for Agatha's money. Focus on the drugs he used to kill her. Focus on his deceit after the murder. Because members of the jury, if you do, you'll see the defendant, he killed Agatha Lee and he is liable. But let's take those three things one at a time. First, the defendant's desperation. Well, today you heard the defendant, he needed money. He had a sick relative back at home, a sick relative he needed to help. But Drew Mars, he knew he was going to be okay. He knew he was in Agatha Lee's will and that he would be taken care of after her death. But members of the jury, that all came crashing down on August 14th. Because that's when the defendant overheard a conversation between Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee, where Miss Lee said she put Stevie Rogers into the will and that she was going to take Drew Mars out. And members of the jury, when the defendant heard that, he panicked. He had to do something to stop Agatha Lee from taking him out of the will. He got desperate. Members of the jury, just hours later, Agatha Lee was found dead. Which takes us to our next point: the drugs. Because today you heard the defendant was Agatha Lee's caretaker. Agatha Lee trusted the defendant implicitly. She even told him, "You know I'll take whatever you hand me." So when the defendant got desperate, when he knew his money was in jeopardy, he knew he had a way out: the drugs. Because today you heard about something called chloroandramine. Now, chloroandramine is an over-the-counter medication, but Agatha Lee had a fatal allergy to it. The defendant even told Stevie Rogers if she takes even one pill, she'd be dead. And you heard that chloroandramine is identical to one of Miss Lee's daily medications. So members of the jury, on August 14th, when the defendant had to act, when he had to do something to stop Agatha from changing her will, he knew what to do. He drugged Miss Lee. He swapped the medications. He gave Agatha Lee the medication that would kill her. But members of the jury, the defense wants you to believe that it was Stevie Rogers who killed her own grandmother, but don't be fooled. Because today you heard about exhibits 14, 15, and 17. And members of the jury, this shows us that it was Drew Mars, not Stevie Rogers, who had a bag of chloroandramine in his closet. It was Drew Mars, not Stevie Rogers, whose fingerprint was found right on that bag. Members of the jury, it was Drew Mars, not Stevie Rogers, who killed Agatha Lee. Members of the jury, let's move on to the defendant's deceit. Because today you heard that on August 20th of 2018, Agatha Lee's will was read aloud to a room full of people. Her attorney announced that Drew Mars was going to inherit Agatha Lee's entire estate. And members of the jury, how did the defendant react? Well, he stood up. He said, I had no idea, and then he stormed out of the room. He acted surprised. He acted shocked. But members of the jury, that's all it was. It was an act. Because today you heard that 6 months earlier. In February of 2018, the defendant sent an email to a friend. Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me. I get everything, the house, the money, everything. We're talking millions of dollars. This is going to totally change my life. Members of the jury, I want you to ask yourselves, why would the defendant lie? If the defendant was an innocent bystander, Why would he get up in front of a room full of people and make a scene? If the defendant was an innocent bystander, why wouldn't he be up front about getting Agatha's money? Well, members of the jury, it's clear. The defendant was an innocent bystander. He was trying to cover up what he had done. But members of the jury, the defense tried telling it something else today. They want you to believe that Stevie Rogers killed her own grandmother, masterminded an entire scheme to set up Drew Mars to then win a civil suit 2 years later and get back her grandmother's money. Does that sound reasonable to you? Does that even sound likely? Members of the jury, if that doesn't sound reasonable or likely to you, it's because it's not. Because we know that Stevie Rogers wasn't desperate for her grandmother's money. We know that Stevie Rogers didn't have chlorandramine in her closet. We know that Stevie Rogers didn't try to deceive anyone after Agatha Lee's death. Because members of the jury, we know that it was Drew Mars, not Stevie Rogers, who killed Agatha Lee. But if you're still not convinced, if you still agree with Mr. McCurdy, if you still think that Stevie Rogers set up Drew Mars, that this is not a coincidence, I want you to think about the defendant's words. Things he said before he even entered the courtroom today. I get everything. The house, the money, everything. Just one pill and Agatha would be dead. I had no idea. Members of the jury, when you listen to the defendant's words, all you're going to hear is desperation, drugs, and deceit. And that's why we're asking you to hold the defendant accountable. We're asking you to find him liable. Thank you.
Defense, whenever you're ready, please proceed.
May it please the court, Your Honor, Mr. Nybart and opposing counsel, members of the jury. It wasn't a coincidence because it was a setup. Now, Mr. Nybart just got up here and he kept telling you it's about desperation, drugs, and deceit. But ladies and gentlemen, he also didn't tell you about a lot of stuff. And perhaps most notably is the fact that he didn't tell you what exactly they had to prove. He didn't explain the law to you. So I want to start with that, because no matter how many times Mr. Nybart repeats those three words, it's not proof. You see, the plaintiff brought this lawsuit under the Slayer statute. And you see on your screen that when you sue under the Slayer statute, the plaintiff bears the burden of proving that in this case, Drew Mars purposefully or knowingly caused Miss Lee's death. And you also see there that they got to do that by a preponderance of the evidence. In other words, they got to show that their case is more likely than not. They have the burden of proof and we don't. But he didn't tell you what the elements were. He didn't tell you the two things they had to show today. So I want to talk about that. Because you see, Mr. Nybart conveniently left that out because they know that this wasn't a coincidence. It was a setup. You see, the first element they had to show you was that Drew Mars took some action to cause Miss Lee's death. Specifically, that Drew Mars switched Miss Lee's medication with chlorandramine. So when you ask yourself, gee, what did the plaintiff show us that showed Drew Mars took that action? Well, they flash an email for you and say, look, he knew about the will, but that doesn't show he took action. Then they bring you a bag, a bottle, and a fingerprint. And they say, that's the proof. That shows he took action. But what Mr. Nybart seems to forget to tell you is that that bag with that bottle, with that fingerprint, wasn't found on August 15th when Miss Lee died, when the plaintiff's hired private investigator searched Drew Mars's room alone. It was conveniently found 6 days later. And they like to tell you, well, the only fingerprint on there was Drew Mars. But you heard on cross-examination when I asked Detective Bond the questions you needed answers to, that there were other fingerprints they couldn't identify, that she didn't search the plaintiff's room. So is there any proof that Drew Mars took action? No. And when you look at that second element, it presupposes the first one was proved, because you can't take action purposefully or knowingly if you didn't take any action to begin with. No. Ladies and gentlemen, right now, right here, I can sit down, go back to counsel table, because the law requires you at this point to find Drew Mars not liable, only because the plaintiff failed to meet their burden, no matter how many times they want you to hear that alliteration. But you see, we didn't stop there. We presented our own evidence, because it wasn't a coincidence, it was a setup. And I want to start by walking through that evidence with you. You heard the plaintiff talk a lot about Drew Mars having knowledge of Miss Lee's chloroangerine allergy. Well, what Mr. Nybart forgets to tell you is that the plaintiff had the same knowledge. They forget to tell you about the other piece of evidence here. They always say Drew Mars had access to Miss Lee's pills on August 14th. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nybart forgot to tell you that the plaintiff had the same access. They also like to talk about who had access to Drew Mars's room, because that bag, that bottle, and that fingerprint were found in his closet 6 days afterwards. But you heard Detective Bond admit when I asked her the question you needed answers to, that bag, that bottle, and that fingerprint, they weren't there on August 15th. They weren't seen the 14th or the 16th or the 17th. No, they were found 6 days later on the 21st, conveniently there. But you also heard that the plaintiff could have had access to Drew Mars's room. You heard that because her room wasn't searched, we don't know what was in there. The plaintiff likes to tell you that Drew Mars had access to Miss Lee's room. But again, they neglect to tell you that the plaintiff had the same access. Members of the jury, you also heard a lot about opposing counsel's timeline, where our client was when. And between the plaintiff and Drew Mars, only one person is able to be tracked the entire day, because you heard in testimony from Drew Mars that the plaintiff was left alone at Lee Manor, that they weren't being seen during that time. We don't know if they went to a pharmacy to acquire chloroangerine, something the plaintiff admitted she knew how to do. We don't know if during that time she switched those pills, but you might be asking yourself why she would do that. Well, the plaintiff forgot to tell you that their own witness, Detective Bond, admits the plaintiff could have had motive. You see, the only person in this case who's claiming that that will was going to be changed is the plaintiff. That's it. Drew Mars has an entirely different account. He tells you that the plaintiff had a conversation with Miss Lee on the 14th, that she asked to be put back in the will, but was denied. But you also heard that the plaintiff had $2 million trust fund that had plummeted to only $2,000. And that's when she showed up at Miss Lee's doorstep. Because the only person in this case who was actually earning money during that time was Drew Mars. So he didn't need the money, but the plaintiff did. The plaintiff had motive. And we come back to the next piece of evidence, knowledge of the Slayer statute. And why is that important? Because the plaintiff knew that she could frame Drew Mars and get the estate, because you heard that she asked to have that will rewritten, that she was going to take Drew Mars out of it so she could inherit the estate. But when she was told no, she decided, if I'm not going to get the estate from Drew Mars, I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to take it. Because none of this evidence is a coincidence, it is a setup. And you heard a lot about the copy of Death in a Bottle in today's case. You might be asking yourself, what in the world does a book have to do with someone's murder? Members of the jury, you heard that the only copy of that book was found in the plaintiff's possession. You heard that she conveniently started reading it before Miss Lee was discovered dead. But you also heard from Miss Cabrera that there are similarities too big to ignore between that book and this case. You see, you heard Miss Cabrera say that in that book, an elderly millionaire was killed with chloroangerine. In this case, that's what happened. You heard that in that book, the caretaker is accused of that murder. In this case, that's what happened. You heard that in the book, the grandchild is the real killer. And in this case, that's what happened. But if that's not enough for you, ladies and gentlemen, we brought our own timeline so we can show you the other half of the picture that the plaintiff wants you to ignore. And our timeline shows you the full week. And you see right there on August 14th, the conversation and the study. where the plaintiff is told, no, you're not going to be put back in the will. Suddenly, hours later, the plaintiff is dead, or excuse me, Miss Lee is dead. And before any investigation, the plaintiff was already calling it murder. Because it's not a coincidence, it's a setup. But if that's not enough for you members of the jury, you see on August 20th that the plaintiff filed today's lawsuit where she alleged that chloroandramine is what killed Miss Lee. August 20th. Now, when you look at that timeline, you see it's not until August 21st that we know there was, in fact, chloroandramine in Miss Lee's system. You see, the plaintiff knew what happened before anybody else did. That's not a coincidence. It is a setup. So when Mr. Nybart talks about desperation, he's really talking about the plaintiff because her $2 million trust fund had fell to $2,000, and unlike Drew Mars, she wasn't earning any money. When he talks about the drugs, he's really talking about the plaintiff because you heard her testify that she knows how to get chloroandramine. You heard in testimony she had access to Miss Lee's pills. You heard she had a motive. And when he talks about deceit, he isn't talking about Drew Mars because, mind you, we've been very upfront about what Drew Mars knew and what their client knew. The only party in this case who's trying to make you look at half the picture is the plaintiff. So when he talks about deceit, he's talking about the plaintiff and this evidence because it's not a coincidence. It is a setup. Now, this is my last chance to speak to you. Mr. Nybart may or may not come back before you, but if he does, see if he can answer why the plaintiff knew exactly what killed Miss Lee before anybody else did. Because it wasn't a coincidence, it was a setup. Find Drew Mars not liable. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Your Honor.
Yes.
May I proceed? Now, members of the jury, Mr. McCurdy just told you that this wasn't a coincidence, that this case is not about coincidences, and we couldn't agree more. Because it's not a coincidence that the defendant went to a pharmacy right after hearing he wasn't going to receive $20 million. It's not a coincidence that chloroandramine was found in his closet a few days later after Agatha Lee died. Members of the jury, it's not a coincidence that the defendant lied about knowing about the will 5 days after Agatha Lee was found dead. And members of the jury, none of these things are coincidences. The defendant got desperate. He turned to drugs that he knew would kill Miss Lee, and then he tried to deceive everyone after the fact. We've met our burden. Find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Okay, I am going